We're in public session. This is the Petroleum and Other Minerals Development Amendment Climate Emergency Measures Bill 2018, the financial implications. And I'd like to welcome Minister of State Sean Canny and his officials to this meeting regarding the financial implications of the Petroleum and Other Minerals Development Amendment Climate Emergency Measures Bill 2018. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And I remind members and witnesses and those in the public gallery to turn off your mobile phones or to switch them onto flight mode. Before we begin, the purpose of this meeting is to discuss the financial implications of the bill and the government's position in relation to for the need for a money message. I'll ask Minister Sean Canny to give your opening statement.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for inviting me to the Joint Committee this afternoon. I would like to cover the policy implications of the People Before Profit Climate Emergency Bill, the steps the Government is taking following on from the recent All-Party Climate Report and declaration of a climate emergency, and finally I want to talk about the financial implications of the bill. As part of its role in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, Ireland has a target of a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. All credible models, such as the work done by the IEA, European Commission and UCC, show that when meeting the Paris objectives, there will still be a need for some oil, and particularly gas, out to 2050, as the Government must plan on how we source that energy for our citizens. If we know and accept that we need some oil and gas during the transition to a low-carbon economy, then there are several clear benefits of using indigenous sources over imported sources. It has a less harmful impact on the environment, as energy does not have to be moved over long distances. The state will get a tax return which will be could be up to 55% in the case of the most recent licensing terms, and there can be obvious energy security benefits as seen by the Kinsale and Corrib gas fields. This tax income could be reinvested in the energy transition by helping with the extensive capital investments we must put towards renewable energy and energy efficiency, in particular our heating and transport systems. In terms of energy security, Europe accounts for approximately 15% of the world's demand for both oil and gas. However, in terms of the world's proven energy reserves, Ireland, and that's including Norway, account for less than 1% for oil and approximately 3% for natural gas. On the other hand, the Middle East and Russia hold over 70% of the proven gas reserves. In essence, the bill will not keep fossil fuels in the ground. It will mean that they are taken out of the ground a long way from Ireland, with all the known disadvantages in doing so. Turning to action being taken by Government, a number of steps have already been taken. In addition, the all-of-Government climate plan, which will shortly be finalised, will set out how this Government intends to make Ireland climate resilient across our entire society. This will involve setting climate goals in all key sectors, including electricity, agriculture, transport, industry, buildings, waste and the public sector. The plan will lead to a significant step up in policy ambition and delivery to ensure that we at least meet our 2030 targets and get on a clear pathway to meeting our 2050 objectives. It is clear that development of offshore wind can be a game changer in helping Ireland reaching its ambitious target of 70% renewable electricity by 2030. There must be a focus on our efforts, and by doing so will put us in a position to take steps such as that proposed in this bill. As regards the financial implications, as you are no doubt aware, the Ceann Comhairle has determined that a money message is required for this bill to progress. The background to this position is as follows. On the 30th of October 2018, the Oireachtas Research and Library Service reported a direct exchequer cost estimate is between 8 and 50 million. On the 26th of November 2018, I expressed my concerns regarding the financial implications of the bill in my letter to this committee ahead of its meeting to consider a scrutiny report. On the 8th of May 2019, I wrote to the Ceann Comhairle detailing my concerns regarding the final implications of the bill, financial implications of the bill, and requested further consideration of a money message. The costs of my letter include those immediately quantifiable ones, such as refund of application fees and licensing fees. There would also be financial implications that would be necessary to prepare for a likely legal challenge from existing licence holders were this bill to be passed. Other financial implications, which are difficult to assess at this point, are the likely compensation to licence holders, There is also the lost potential revenue to the state in the form of direct tax revenue, which could be used to fund the energy transition and taxes arising from economic activity associated with this development. If there is an impact on the Exchequer, I am bound to make it known. I would also note that since this bill was introduced, we have new protocols in place which give helpful clarity on all concerned on these processes going forward. The Government has indicated that it is opposed to this bill because it does not reduce Ireland's emissions. It does not encourage renewable energy, and it makes Ireland more dependent on energy imports. It will oblige us to import all our needs when Kinsale gas field is closing soon and Corrib is declining, and within 5 years it will only meet a quarter of our gas demand before being depleted entirely in approximately 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And the first person who's indicated is Senator McDowell, and then. But I'm okay. Yeah, I might bring you in first. Is that okay?
No problem.
Yeah, Deputy Smith. I might bring Deputy Smith in first. It's your bill. Is that okay? And I'll take it in order of who indicated. Okay, Deputy Smith.
I don't know how long you're giving me, but I have quite a few questions. So
yeah, okay, fire ahead.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
I suppose the first thing to say about it is that I find it quite shocking that even at this late stage, having been given 3 opportunities of lengthy debates on this bill, that you are actually raising these concerns now at this point. I find that quite insulting and shocking, and I don't take it personally. I find it insulting to the movement out there, to the thousands of children who went on strike, and to the movement out there who daily are mobilising and organising to try and get this government to do something meaningful in terms of dealing with the global corporations who inflict the greatest damage on the planet. And that's why we want to see the fossil fuels left in the ground, because, just to repeat, the science has settled on 80% of known fossil fuels must remain in the ground. But my first question to you is, what do you actually think other countries should do with their reserves of fossil fuels? If we're not going to import from them, and if they are going to move towards transition to renewables, what do you think they should do with them? Do you think that they should leave theirs in the ground, but we shouldn't leave ours? And would you just explain to me why you think that this is an Irish issue rather than a global issue? On specific questions on the 7 applications that you have on hand, when were these made? And when, if any, decision has been made on them by the department? The point is to tease out how the fees that these companies paid have to be returned, and how that constitutes an appropriation of public money. The way I see it is, if they paid fees and we have to give them back, that's not an appropriation of public money, that's returning something that was given and would have a net zero impact on the public purse. On the repayment of the acreage rental fees, does this figure apply to all existing licences? Does it include the 3 licences that cover the existing 4 operating sites? And why does the Department think that it must return these fees? The bill doesn't stop the holders of existing licences from continuing to explore. It simply stops you as Minister from issuing any further licences once carbon in the atmosphere is above the 350 parts per million. And what, if anything, does a climate emergency mean if it's not that we have to take into cognizance the level of CO2 in the atmosphere? And does that not constitute the basis of an emergency? We've just declared a climate emergency in Dáil Éireann, and I just wanted to remind you of that. I think there's one of the reasons why we call this bill the Climate Emergency Measures Bill was not because we knew how we had the foresight to know that the Dáil would have declared a climate emergency 18 months after it was introduced, but because we were very aware of the fact that when the financial crash happened, overnight the government could construct financial emergency measures and take pay and pensions and all sorts of conditions away from workers in the public sector, and many of those punitive measures still exist. But we don't seem to be able to take measures in a climate emergency to deal with fossil fuel corporations, to deal with, for example, companies like Exxon or the Chinese State Corporation, who actually were given a licence by you a couple of days after the climate emergency was declared. to extract gas and oil or to explore for gas and oil off the Kerry coast. And I think you have to explain that contradiction, why a government can deal with one emergency in one way and another emergency in another. And if you did actually declare a climate emergency, does that not give you a right to be able to deal with the licences that exist? You talk about an automatic right of progression between licences, but I think that we have to challenge that, because in the 2007 terms, the criteria for an application or an authorisation are, and I quote, having regard to the authorisation applied for the work programme proposed by the applicant, the technical competence and offshore experience of the applicant, the financial resources available to the applicant, and here, D, the important one, the applicant's policy to health, safety and environment, the policy of the fossil fuel industry to the health and safety and the environment that we live in. And if burning fossil fuels isn't already proven to be very damaging to the environment and to the health and safety of everybody on the planet, why would you then see that you have to give a continuing licence and to move on to the next step? Is that not good enough for you to be able to say, I'm sorry, you're not entitled to the next step up because your policy to the health and safety of the planet is not good enough? I've finished very soon, Chair. I'm very sorry for taking so much time. In regard to the lease undertakings and the 2007 terms, it states there that in the event that the licensee is unable to subsequently confirm as commercial the discovery so notified, but it is of the opinion that it may become commercial and the Minister concurs. Well, here's a question for you, Minister. If we are told by the IPCC and by the scientists that within the next 11 to 12 years we have to seriously start dealing with the level of fossil fuels that we're burning, and if a company says to you today, I want to go out there and explore for gas or oil, which I can prove to you will be commercially viable, what is commercially viable about a product that we're being told we have to stop burning? And if in 20 years' time, when it's ready to be burnt, because it takes about that period of time to be, even if we find it, to explore it and to manufacture it, to bring it to the surface and to burn it, in 20 years' time, are you saying that it's going to be okay to burn billions and billions of tonnes worth of carbon that have been extracted from the Irish Sea, or the seas off Ireland, and that that's going to be commercially viable? If we are moving to renewables and that fossil fuels will become a thing of the past, where's the commercial viability in it? On the petroleum lease, it clearly says when a petroleum lease is applied for under paragraph 1 and the Minister is satisfied by reference to the likely production profile and the applicant's development, financial and marketing plans that a commercial discovery has been made, it shall be the duty of the Minister to grant the application. I put the question of commercial viability to you again. What is commercially viable about a discovery which in 20 to 25 years' time has no place on this planet, that we shouldn't be burning it and shouldn't be using it? So if we're in a climate emergency and the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, and all of these applicants want to increase it by extracting more fossil fuels, gas or oil, and they're frantically engaged in we know that they're engaged in trying to derail this bill. They're lobbying. We can see that from the lobbying register. They're lobbying very hard, lobbying senators, lobbying TDs to try and stop this bill going forward. But they continue to want to search our waters for more sources of carbon that they can burn. But if this is an emergency, would you not agree that we have to move from fossil fuels in the next 11 years, and how it can be deemed commercial after a decade or more? Or indeed, in the interests of the public or the interests of the environment? You have many ways, Minister, of being able to say that you do not have to progress to the next stage, because that is what the legislation currently says. You just choose to ignore it. And I want to say that these companies have no claim on public money for compensation. They've no claim on money even to return the fees to them, because it is explicit in the terms and conditions that neither Exxon, Providence or Petrol or any of the companies that apply to you have any claim to the future of our school children, to the future of this planet. They've no right to the global commons in order to pursue their own profits. I'm sort of wondering, Minister, if you'll absolutely be honest with me and come back on these questions in an honest way, instead of trying to use procedural trickery. The game is up for these companies. It may not be up in Ireland yet, but it'll be eventually up. And I think you need to go back to the drawing board and think very carefully about what you're asking here today in terms of arguing here today in terms of a money message on this bill. I would argue, and I repeat, I've just said it in the Dáil, that a money message of this level, there's very, very little of public money that would be due to be paid out to these companies. And by comparison to the sort of wastage that this government and others engage in, this would actually be doing not just the people of this country a favour, but the planet and the fight for climate action a huge favour. So based on these figures, I find it unbelievable that you think that this bill should have a money message. Unbelievable that it should have it, and absolutely unacceptable that you're bringing it at this point in time when we should be sitting here discussing how we amend this bill, how we make it better, who wants to put in what, and having a real debate about things like energy security and the future for renewables in this country, instead of this pretend debate where trickery comes before the genuine concerns of senators and deputies who are genuinely concerned about dealing with climate action.
I might ask the Minister to respond. I know there's a number of questions there, so in any order you wish.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and respond as best I can, and as always, honestly. First of all, lobbying, I don't know who's lobbying who, but I have not been lobbied, just to put that on the record.
Have you checked the lobbying register? Have you looked at it at all?
We'll just let the Minister...
No, I've just, when you mentioned about lobbying, I just want to get that on the record that I haven't been lobbied. I suppose, you know, you talk about, for instance, when you're issuing a licence, and I just want to say clearly on that, is that you say you cannot issue a further licence if and whatever else doesn't happen. The licence which I sanctioned 2 weeks ago was based on there was no reason not to give that licence. They met all of the environmental, all of the financial, and all of the regulations that they had to meet. So I just couldn't not grant that licence. And that's an exploratory licence, by the way. It's not a licence, it's to drill a hole, an exploratory drill. It's not to do anything else. So just to kind of, the terminologies that we use, I think it's important to say that. The other thing I want to raise is that, you know, why is it today or yesterday that I mentioned about the whole idea of a money message? I just want to put it on record that I spoke about this, and I've said it in my opening remarks. It was I think in November I first raised this, and the idea of, I said there was 5 financial implications. The adjudication as to whether there's a money message in this is at the behest of the Cancórla, and he has deemed that there is a money message required. These are the facts.
Sorry, Chairperson, can I ask you again to please be honest about this? You wrote a 4-page letter to the Cancórla arguing for the money message to be given.
Okay.
So don't put him before you. You wrote the 4-page letter.
We'll just let the Minister...
I suppose what I would say is that I followed up on my previous notifications that there was financial implications, and I notified the Cancórla in writing. He made the adjudication, not I, that a money message was required. You know, I think that we have to be very clear here when we're talking about the future, and we're talking about the next 10, 15, 20 years. We will always require to have, for the next up to 2050 and beyond, we will have a requirement for fossil fuels. We just cannot say we don't need them. We will need them, and even when we meet our targets in 2030, I think you will see that we will be moving from 30% energy to renewables to 70%. We still have 30% of a gap to make up. And the important thing is that when we're looking at that back out to 2050 and beyond, how do we manage that? And I would say to you, Deputy, and I've said this before in public, that your bill is well-intentioned. And I think it's important that we recognise that as well. So what we need to do is we need to say, right, we have an all-of-government or an all-of-government approach to climate action, which will be published in the coming days or coming weeks. And within that, we should be working to see how we can meet our targets. I believe that this bill, as I said, is well-intentioned. But at the end of the day, What we have to make sure is that we have security of supply, that we, you know, you talk about, why are we looking at this just as Ireland? Fossil fuels are not available in every country. There's exports and imports are always in play. Do we want to be, for the next 20, 30 years, be getting our gas or our oil from fracked gas, from shale gas, from sources we don't know, which would be a lot more damaging to the environment? Or do we have a security of supply, and if we do have the security of supply, we know how it will come into this country, we know how it will be used, and as well as that, we will gain up to 55% in taxation to help us deliver what we require over the next 30 years, which everybody aspires to.
You're fooling yourself, Minister.
We'll just let the Minister continue his answer.
I suppose you mentioned about the licensing regime, and that's structured in a way that if the companies meet their obligations, there is a legal expectation that they will be allowed to proceed. And that's what I was saying about the drilling that we did, or the licence which we issued 2 weeks ago. You take it that there's one of the things that the costs that the Ceann has looked at. He has looked at the 12 applications for petroleum exploration authorisations involving the award of acreage are currently under consideration. And it should be noted that petroleum organisations may progress from one form to another, e.g. from a licensing option converts to an exploration office, which converts to a lease undertaking and finally to production phase in a petroleum lease. So you cannot allow a company, or you can't expect a company to go in and do so much work and then tell them you cannot go any further, unless they are in breach of the regulations or they cannot meet the high standards which we have in terms of assessments environmentally, financial assessments and all that goes with that, and also that they fulfil all their obligations within the licensing regime.
Can I interrupt you there, Minister, because that's
briefly.
precisely what I mean. You have it in your gift, you or the next Minister, you have it in your gift to decide if this bill was passed. You have it in your gift to say to them, environmentally you're not meeting the standards that are required, because the licensing regime allows you to stop them going to the next stage on the basis of their environmental record. And if the bill were passed, it would be looking at the overall atmosphere and the levels of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And these companies would breach that. You have it in your gift to say, no, you're not going no further, without any legal retribution to you, because it's written in the law.
I would have to say that when a company makes an application for a licence or to do an exploration or to do a drill, they have to fulfil certain obligations within our jurisdiction. They have to provide the impact statements, they have to provide the appropriate assessments, they have to provide the financial guarantees, they have to do all of that. And if they do all of that, and it's adjudicated on not by me but by an independent authority, I have no reason, or any minister just cannot say you cannot proceed.
So there's no such thing as a climate emergency. Climate change isn't real. 350 parts per million is not the safe levels of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yes, and what I would say to you is, if we want to work to do that, and I'll be awful honest here, this bill that you are proposing as a standalone bill will do nothing to change our carbon emissions. It will do nothing for that. What we need to do is we need to stand up together and make sure that we bring forward measures that we can meet our targets in a very managed, strategic way, and at the same time that we do not leave people without light, without heat, or without jobs. So we have to balance it in a way that we reach the targets and at the same time transition in a fair way, and that's what we need to do.
Well, if in 20 years' time they find the gas or the oil, and in 20 years' time it's brought to the point of being able to be burnt in this country, by this country, do you not think that allowing these companies to pump billions of tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere would not breach our emissions limits, would not breach the whole idea of declaring a climate emergency and trying to deal with it?
Yeah, and I think that just to answer that, simplest way possible, that in 20 years' time we may be extracting gas that we're actually taking the carbon out of before we use it. The technologies are looking at that at the moment. So what's going to happen in 20 years' time with the advancements we'll have in technologies, I cannot see. But what my and the government's actions are to try and make sure that we meet the targets for 2030 and the targets for 2050 based on a managed transition which will be fair to everybody in society.
Doesn't make sense.
I'm going to move on to Senator Michael McDowell, who's next on my list.
Well, I want to make a couple of things plain. I opposed the Deputy's bill and remain totally opposed to it for a number of reasons that I want to put on the record now. And I don't believe that in doing so I am insulting the movement, the environmental movement, or the children's initiative or anything of that kind. I think I'm looking after those children. I think I'm looking after their interests in the long term. The simple fact is the Minister has stated again and again, and as Deputy Smith continues to ignore, is that this country is going to remain partially dependent on fossil fuels for or their equivalent until 2050 at any rate. That's a simple fact. We are not going to be able to go 100% to renewables, and we are not going to achieve absolutely carbon neutral energy production for 30 years from now. That's a simple fact. So the question, as the Minister has put it, in my view, is very succinct. It's where is our fossil fuel energy going to come from, not are we going to use it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you look at the energy requirements of our changing society, we have a growing population. We have increased dependence on electricity. Electricity can only be generated by either renewable sources such as solar, wind, or biofuels of some kind. That's one source. Or alternatively, from fossil fuels to some extent, or from atomic energy. Those are we cannot produce electricity other than by those means. The next point that we have to face up to honestly, and Deputy Smith constantly refers to the need to be honest. If there was some, if as the Minister's figures prove, Western Europe is going to be hugely dependent on imported gas over the next 20, 30 years. If that is the case, we have to remember that in the event of any disruption, major disruption to that supply of fuels from Eastern Europe and the Middle East, Russia in particular, we would be the first to suffer because we would be one of the weakest and most peripheral economies. We would be the person to whom gas rationing would be applied in the way least favourable to ourselves if it was a question of whether German industry, British industry, French industry, or whatever it is, the lowlands or whatever, if there was a threat to their gas supply. So let's be honest. We are going to need, we're closing down Money Point in 5 years' time. We are going to need backup gas electricity generation capacity for the next 20 years, no matter what way anybody in this room wishes it to be. And the only issue is whether we should say we are going to stop all oil exploration and extraction in Irish waters and as a matter of principle and import everything from somewhere else in the world. It's not a question of saying we're going to abandon fossil fuels. The second point that I think the Deputy Smith's bill doesn't take into account is that in the transformation from fossil fuels to other forms of energy, renewables in particular, the taxation policies of the state are going to be crucial, whether they're carbon taxes, excise duties, all sorts of things of that kind. They are going to be crucial because they are the economic lever whereby you make some forms of energy generation more economic and others less economic in accordance with the public good. And, you know, I've sat in this committee and asked successive witnesses about things like the data centres that are being built at the moment, which have the potential to increase the demand of Irish electricity by 1/3 at a time when we're supposed to be in a climate emergency. And I have never received satisfactory answers. So, to me, it's very, very simple, and I believe that we should be utterly honest. We cannot give up the consumption of fossil fuels unilaterally or in the short to medium term. We can't do it. And if that's the case, we have a simple choice. Do we rely on the goodwill of others if there's a gas shortage emergency in 10, 15, 20 years' time? Or do we use whatever resources nature has made available to us to avoid that risk? That's the only issue. And to portray this as somehow a capitulation to multinationals is wrong. I want to just talk about the legal implications for a second. It seems to me that property rights under the Constitution are always subject to the common good. And therefore, Deputy Smith is right in one respect. If it were the case that there was a climate emergency and that it was necessary to abrogate the rights of drillers, developers, explorers or licensees, we could do it if it was done in the interest of the common good. And that would just be too bad for the people who suffer economically as a consequence. Property rights aren't sacrosanct. And the other point that I want to make is in relation to the money message point. I've seen in relation to the Palestinian, the occupied territories, the invocation by the government of the money message method as a way of denying passage to that bill. And I'm very strongly of the view that that's not done correctly and it's legally incorrect. It involves a misunderstanding of what Standing Order 179, paragraph 2 of the Dáil Standing Orders is. It also involves a misunderstanding of the relationship between Article 15 and Article 17 of the Constitution. And I'm just saying, my opposition, if the government can actually point to Deputy Smith's bill actually having the incidental effect of requiring the public funds to be appropriated to a particular purpose, the money message idea is correct. If they can't establish that, the mere fact that it's tax foregone or something like that isn't correct. So, but I want to come back to the final point. I believe, if we're being honest and non-ideological about this, our state needs to keep its energy options open and to not to put itself in the position that if there was an energy crisis, if Vladimir Putin turned off the taps and there was a crisis in the Middle East, that we would find that we had no means whatsoever of sustaining an economy which is going to be increasingly dependent on electricity. I mean, if we're going to have electric cars, somebody's going to have to generate that electricity. If we're going to have an electronic economy, an economy based on the internet and the like, and service economy, all of that will require electricity. If we're going to ban back boilers, if we're going to ban solid fuel, if we're going to ban all of those things, it's electricity that this country is going to demand more and more. And if we're going to have data centres, even more. And it seems to me that being honest about this, the question is, does this bill, if introduced, amount to a gesture, which I believe it does amount to a gesture, and I accept what Mr. Canny said, that it's well-intentioned. But does it involve the very serious risk that other countries would, in the event of a gas energy crisis in Europe, put us in the position of having to beg for our existence on a network of international pipelines. And I can't for the life of me see, and I agree with the Minister's point of view, that this isn't about the amount of gas that's used in Ireland, because that will be determined. The relative price of renewable and non-renewable energy can be determined by government policy, including carbon taxes and the like. What we're dealing with here is a simple question: do we expose ourselves to a massive crisis which could destroy this country economically, simply on a point of principle and in furtherance of a gesture? And I'd ask the Minister, does he agree with the points I'm making?
Minister.
Thank you. And I do. I think the biggest thing that we have to realise, as you say, is the fact that if this bill, as it is, was enacted, what would we be doing? What are we doing with the carbon emission targets that we need to set? What would this bill do for that? And the other, I suppose, thing is that we have to look at this is that if you take our reserves, Europe, and that includes Norway, account for 1% for oil reserves and 3% for natural gas. The Middle East and Russia hold over 70% of the proven gas reserves. So where are we if there is a crisis? And remember, with Brexit and all that goes with that, we are relying on a pipe coming through the UK for gas. As well as that, we have to look and say, what do we want to achieve? And the debate here is about achieving our targets for 2030 and 2050 in a way that is managed, in a way that is fair, and that we have a transition. So we look at it on the whole, holistically, and see how we can actually achieve that. Protect jobs, protect our supplies. And the other thing that happens, we talk about energy, we talk about transport, we talk about the electric cars, we talk about all of these infrastructures that we need to make sure are, I suppose, transitioned. We cannot rely totally on wind. We cannot rely totally on the sun. We have to have backups. And one of the backups is to plant a huge amount of batteries for storage across this country. We've got to face up to this. What would that be like? So we have to make sure that whatever we do, that we do it in a way that is managed, it's progressive, and it achieves the targets in a strategic way. And that we don't make this country any poorer, or its people any weaker or any poorer over the next 20 to 50 years.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to bring in Deputy Eamon Ryan next.
I would suggest that we would seek the legal advice from the Oireachtas legal services on what's happened with this particular bill. I think we need a root and branch investigation from start to end as to the process, because I believe what the government has done is fundamentally unfair to the members of the Oireachtas, unfair to our constituents who we represent. And I think I would like to be able to see the legal advice in terms of, and the right to question our legal advisors with regard to what's happened in the particular process of this bill. Because I think Deputy Bríd Smith's absolutely right. The truth, we all know it, is just the last minute the government realised that they don't have the numbers to block it. It might actually become law. And they pulled a card from under the deck and at the last minute threw it onto the table to say you're not going to have the pleasure of even debating it at committee stage.
Just
and I
on
think
that, Deputy, the decision by the Ceann Comhairle, that's a constitutional function of the Ceann Comhairle, and just we as a committee are not in a position, we don't have any role in reviewing the Ceann Comhairle's decision. It's not a legal matter, just to clarify.
No, I'm not suggesting, and I raised this with the Ceann Comhairle in order of business today, so, and he confirmed we could seek legal advice, that it wasn't, in a sense, I'm not questioning his final decision, but I want to look at the whole approach that has been taken from start to end by the government on this piece of legislation, because I believe it's an egregious insult to the institutions of the Oireachtas that we've been treated in the way that we have been treated, and I think that should be legally. I would like to have the chance to legally question our own lawyers in regard to what possible or what are the implications of the process here. And I would like that to be done in a timely manner, because I think this is the critical first issue we're debating here, is how has the Oireachtas actually, and the executive have, in my mind, exceeded their powers in the way they've dealt with this bill. That's not a small issue. I think it should be examined by our legal advisers, and we should have the chance to question the legal advisers in that regard. And the Crown Court seemed to confirm that when I asked him earlier on in order of business.
So it's not questioning the Crown Court's decision.
No.
That's fine if you clarify that. Thank you.
If I could just briefly, without going back to the full second stage debate we've had to a certain extent, and I fundamentally disagree with Senator McDowell. This is not gesture politics. Those 4 seismic licences I think you've just given out yesterday will destroy large sections of marine life in the Northwest Atlantic at a time when our wildlife system is in real peril. Will do massive damage. And if we succeed in finding oil in the Northwest Atlantic, that oil being pumped out and pumped into the atmosphere is the greatest threat to our security, the greatest threat to those young people you say that you seek to also represent. So I do not believe this is gesture. I think it's the exact opposite. This is the most real, most physical, most tangible element of the challenge we have that we need to make. Can I ask the Minister, you just say in your commentary, in your speech presentation, I'm taking, for example, the licenses have just been given, the exploration licenses for the Chinese offshore oil company with ExxonMobil to drill off the Kerry coast. Now, it's far out. It's in the Porcupine, so it's several hundred kilometres out. You say that, just to say, for example, if we struck oil there or gas there, you say that it has a less harmful impact on the environment, as energy does not have to be moved over long distances. Can you explain to me why oil pumped out from the North Atlantic is less harmful to the environment, or gas?
That's it. Yeah. First of all, if I just recap, if the committee wish to bring in legal people, I've no issue with that, to discuss how things are done. I suppose, first of all, that drill licence for the borehole is 232 kilometres, not 700 kilometres out.
I said a couple hundred, I said.
Sorry, 232 kilometres out. I suppose what I would say is that you say about the lateness of a money message or cost implications. I came into this role on October 16th last year, and on 26th November I expressed my concerns to the committee about the costs involved in this bill. I'm not aware that we have no seismic survey applications or consents on hand. And we have some site survey applications on hand, but not the seismic. What was the other question?
How is it that oil or gas discovered in the deep Atlantic is less harmful in the environment?
Because if you take it that we will be able to control how it is extracted, would you prefer that or fracked gas, for shale gas? And also, if you take that on the western, is the closest to us in terms of transporting the gas to us. We have existing infrastructures which could very well be used to bring it on shore to refine it. So that is where we are in control of how things are done. Whereas if you go out to Russia or you go to wherever, go to Canada or whatever, and we don't have any control on how they do their business, and we have then to buy this gas with no control on how it's been done.
How does it have a less harmful impact on the environment?
First of all, transport costs are transportation of the fuel are cheaper for us to get to our country.
Where do you expect that oil or gas to come ashore?
It depends on where it's found.
Let's take the example of the Kerry field. Where would that come ashore?
That more than likely would come ashore onto Cork or Kerry.
What makes you think that?
Because that's the nearest land point.
Do you think you'd run a pipeline for 230 kilometres underwater?
If it's gas, what I'm saying to you is that normally land the gas at the nearest land point, and the nearest land point is Ireland.
My understanding from previous experience in this is that when you get above a certain distance, and certainly 230 kilometres is way above that distance, you wouldn't run a pipeline directly to the shore. You would actually ship it. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on what the proposal they come up with if they find the reserves, and that has to be adjudicated on by us before a further licence is issued.
Maybe the officials here will be able to help in this. Is it not the case that when you're over 230 kilometres from shore, and that's the Kerry shore, which is not necessarily the place you'd probably land it, but in those circumstances you would not run a pipeline, you would ship it?
Depends on what, if it's oil, you may be shipping it. If it's gas, you may be piping it.
So where would you ship it?
Well, you could ship it into Cork, or it could be going someplace else.
Whitegate's very specific in the oil it can take. It can only take a very particular type of crude oil. There's no guarantee whatsoever.
And you're asking me to give you an answer to a question which is hypothetical until we see what is found there.
I'm asking you to explain to me how it's less harmful to the environment to have oil or gas pumped out of the North Atlantic, which is in 2 kilometres or so of water, which is incredibly expensive and requires huge energy-intense, environmental damaging procedures to bring ashore and then to ship to a distant location to refine. They will not land in Ireland, the likelihood at any stage, and then ship back here because it's a fungible traded market. I think it's utter bumpkin that this is greener gas or oil in some way. The Taoiseach was at it in the order of business or in leaders' questions today. I'd love to see the evidence that makes you think this is less harmful in the environment. I don't hear anything.
Well, if you allow me to answer, first of all, we have the other options are we close down all of our exploration.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to do.
Where do we get our
from the fungible international oil and gas markets?
Where are they? Who controls them?
Access shale oil and things like that.
Yes.
I presume you want.
It's likely
brought in LPG containers.
Carrick, if we're going to have a second stage debate here, it is true that if we're going to live up to climate science, we keep 80% of the known reserves underground.
Yes.
That keeps the shale reserves underground. Because actually the last 20% you'd use would be the cheapest, probably Saudi oil and others. But for us to continue exploring, looking for more, when we already know that 4/5 have to stay in the ground, is wanton environmental destruction. It's ecocide of the highest order. It has to stop.
I don't concur with you that it has to stop, because we have to make sure that we have a security of supply.
There's no security off a Kerry 230 kilometres out. It's a 50-to-1 bet anyway. And even if it did strike unlucky, it would be shipped into some distant shore, not into Irish waters.
Okay.
If you look at what we have brought in so far, it's come into Kinsale and it's come into Corrib. Corrib has 6 pipes bringing the gas in, and it is designed in a way to take in future demand around
And the
that
experience
area.
from that, if I can't finish, is that if it was a further distant field, it would not be brought ashore in that way. And that's what makes me think that this security argument and this greener than green argument is utter bumpkin, as I said.
Yeah, well, you're repeat that now. I just want to finish.
I'd like to hear the evidence.
Deputy Ryan, can you let the minister?
Maybe
answer
there's more
the
questions to ask, and then I'll answer them.
Have you other questions, Deputy?
Well, could I show the evidence that you think on the Porcupine Bank we're going to be shipping? Show me the energy, international gas experts or oil experts that predict that that would be brought ashore in Irish refineries.
Well, first,
I'd like to see that now.
Okay, can you let the minister reply, Deputy Ryan?
please. What I would say is that what we have in our jurisdiction is we have a very strong drilling safety and environmental rules in play. We also have a situation where our proven track record and anything we have drilled for that has come into Kinsale or come into Corrib has been done in a way that's very environmentally friendly. We have generated an infrastructure that is there and that could be used. I cannot predict if a gas or an oil is found at a particular location where exactly it's going to be brought to today. All I can tell you is that we need to make sure that we have the supply that is required, that we need in this country for the next 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 years. We have to do that in a way that is managed, that we don't have a knee-jerk reaction to something and then find that the consequences of what we do could be detrimental to our future economy for the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. So what we need to do is we need to be so clear about this that we have to do it in a managed, strategic way to achieve the goals. And I can assure you that when the Climate Action Plan is launched, you will see fully what we mean by that. And I would hope that that plan will be taken on board by all politicians, and we will work together for the benefit and for the security of our country.
Deputy Ryan, do you have more questions?
One last question.
Yeah.
The Minister says that they're thinking in 20 years' time the technology will come where we take the carbon out of the fossil fuels before we use it. Can he just explain what he thinks that is, or what's the technology?
At the moment, now I'm not a scientist, but basically it's to take the hydrogen from the gas and to use that to feed into the gas. And I think you could then have a mix of 30% hydrogen in with the gas. And that could be used within the existing infrastructure that we have in place in Ireland to the homes and to the appliances that would be safe. And that type of what I call technology is still in its infancy, but it's something that is being worked on and being researched on. So what we have to make sure is we don't do something that leaves all that infrastructure we have in place redundant, and then find that potentially in 10, 20, 30 years we have a situation where we have something new that we could use in this infrastructure.
Deputy James Lawless.
Thanks, Chairperson. Thanks, Minister, and welcome to the committee. I'm struggling to. I was somewhat shocked to hear this decision a week or two ago when it was communicated to the committee that this money message issue had reared its head again. I think 2 years after it was initially told that a money message wasn't required. And it just strikes me the government is, I suppose, at best inconsistent and at worst hypocritical, because there aren't degrees of emergency. There's an emergency or there isn't an emergency. And if the government thinks there's not an emergency, why is it saying that there is in the Dáil and agreeing motions and voting motions and telling us it's going to announce the dividend all in terms of incentives and measures next week? So you can't have it both ways. There is an emergency or there isn't an emergency. And if there is one, why are we even debating this? I don't want to rehash the policy arguments, but I'm going to briefly touch on a few that have been mentioned today, because we've had second stage debate. The whole point of us being here today is to discuss a technical measure being adopted by the government to block this bill. And that's the nub of it. We've had a second stage debate. Second stage has been voted on, has been voted through by vote of the Dáil. It's been voted through by committee. It's been voted through again by the Dáil when it was attempted to be blocked by other procedural means. So we've had the debates, we've had the policy debates. We were looking forward around this committee to tabling constructive amendments in the next, we thought today, or in the near future, that would actually move this on again. And it's worth mentioning as well, and the Minister should be aware of this, and Fianna Fáil had said, some of the Minister's concerns, and I'm going to get into those in detail in a minute, around potential exposures, etc., that certainly my party had already communicated we would be tabling amendments to address some of the technical issues, some of the lacunas that may have arisen, and some of the exposures that might have been brought to the state. So that was already in hand. But I think the government, for political or other reasons, have decided to block the bill and have found a way to do it. And this has been thrown in at the last minute as a spanner in the works. And I do think that I think the credibility of a government going out, or you know, not the Oireachtas, because the Oireachtas is more or less on message on this by the government, saying to consumers, for example, that we have to implement a carbon tax, and that consumers are being, I suppose, their behaviours are being influenced by measures like carbon tax, to say that they should reduce their consumption of fossil fuels, whilst at the same time we're telling the producers keep on burning, keep on drilling. It just seems completely incoherent and completely hypocritical and very unfair, actually, on all involved. Another point that I'd make briefly, and I want to get on to this technical points because that's the real nub of the discussion today, but we hear all these arguments about our needs for fossil fuels and our need for energy, etc., energy security into the future. At what point do we begin to make the decision to renewable energy climate, to renewable energy economy, when we don't start? The day you begin to move off something is the day you start to move on to the new thing. If we are going to forever commit, and we're going to 10 years' time, 20 years' time, and 50 years' time, or in 2050 we're looking at our energy needs then, at what point do we begin? Because in terms of investment in technology, in terms of research, in terms of education, in terms of mindsets, in terms of companies looking at opportunities, you need to start that wheel turning. And you need to start that wheel turning pretty quickly in terms of renewable energy opportunities. And you need to stop the other wheel turning in parallel. And you cannot, the longer you keep the other wheel spinning, the longer you take for the other wheel to start moving. So this whole green revolution that I think is out there in terms of jobs, in terms of technology, I think there's economic opportunity there as well, in terms of engineering, in terms of R&D, in terms of our green energy opportunities that are considered very rich in this island, but we're not going to get there any day soon, the longer we keep trying to milk the old system. Another point I just want to quickly rebut, I suppose I'll ask the Minister rather than saying I rebut it, because maybe the Minister can inform me if I'm wrong. But one of the kernels of this debate, and again we're rehashing second stage, but just to put it on the record again, we're being told in the committee today by the Minister and other places where this is being debated that we have an exposure for energy security, and in the absence of Irish offshore resources, then we will suddenly be dependent on Vladimir Putin's goodwill or on Arab sheikhs' behest, which is a strong argument. But I'm not sure, and I want to ask the Minister this, there's no Irish state exploration company. Ireland Inc. isn't out there in the Porcupine Basin drilling or exploring for oil. We have no state exploration vehicle, to my knowledge. We have people like Exxon and Chinese exploration companies bidding for licenses and winning licenses in some cases, who then, as I understand it, can pretty much sell it to the highest bidder, who can then explore it, extract it, and sell it on. And Deputy Ryan, I think, alluded to some of this a few moments ago as well. So, Minister, is there any guarantee? Because if what you're saying is correct, and I'm giving a good hearing, and I think there's an argument to be made there in terms of energy security. I'm not convinced by it, but I think there's an argument to be made. Why are you not bringing forward a bill ring fencing all those future fines for the Irish state? Am I wrong? Is there something in there already that says Irish offshore exploration licences must be ring fenced for the Irish system, for the Irish economy? Is there something in there that does that already? Because it strikes me as being very useful. I have other questions, but maybe put that question and then get the answer and then move on to my other.
Okay, we'll try and get through them. I'm just conscious of time. Minister, if you'd like to respond to that question.
Yes, just about the. You mentioned one of the things you mentioned there was about we should move away first, and then from what we're at, and then do something different.
We should do both at the same time.
I would say that what we should do is we should move away first, and that's what we're doing. If you take today electricity, 32% of it is renewable, whereas in 2003 it was 3%. So we are moving. We are moving in the area of transport. We are moving. We are making progress. So I think it's important that people understand, and the rhetoric is that we're doing nothing or nothing is being done. A lot of work is being done. And I think that is very important to stress that again. Irish Rail, Bus Éireann, they're all going towards electric or battery operated vehicles. They're moving away from the fossil fuel reliance. So our target is to reach 70% renewables by 2030. That's the plan, and that's what we're moving towards. But you have to think about the other 30%. How is that going to be kept in play? How do we secure a supply, a reliance that we still have on natural gas, on our fossil fuels, because we won't be 100%. So that's the debate. And what I've been saying here all day is we have to do this in a structured way. And I agree that we just cannot do one and finish it and then stop the other. We have to transition it. And that's the word. We have to transition. We have to do it in a fair way. And we have to do it in a very balanced way. And we have to make sure that we don't do anything that will make our people poorer, leave people without supply, leave people without electricity, leave people without gas at critical times. And that is what is important.
Yeah.
I ask you to ask a number of questions. It just might help. I'm just conscious of all the people who want to come in and come back in again. If you could.
Okay. Well, I'll come in quickly again, and I maybe had a long prelude. Minister, I don't think you answered the core point I asked. If the concern is future energy security,
I didn't get a chance.
Would we not? Well, you were going to come back in. Sorry, maybe I preempted you.
Well,
sorry.
Ask the questions and I'll answer them.
Is there any commitment in current licences that it would be ring-fenced for the Irish economy, and that guarantee supply to Ireland would be guaranteed from the current licences or prospective licences?
Well, I suppose what I would say on the security of supply is that, consistent with international practice, both the UK and Norway, for instance, there is no specific requirement on exploration companies to sell oil or gas discovered in Irish offshore into the Irish market. A combination of practical factors and market forces will dictate to where these local demands exist. A discovery will be landed and sold locally to ensure maximum recovery from the field and reduce cost of transportation. In all cases, the state's fiscal regime applies to the production of all Irish offshore. All commercial finds to date, Kinsale Head, Ballycotton, Seven Heads and Corrib, have been delivered into the Irish market. That's what has happened so far.
Thanks, Minister, but that does sound like no is the answer, paraphrasing. I'm going to move on swiftly because I know the Chair is anxious to move around the room. I guess the substantive point, the reason we're here today is because the committee have approved the bill, the Dáil has approved the bill twice, and yet we're here again, and I think it's 2 years on. And I do note, and I know you referenced the Ceann Comhairle, but the Ceann Comhairle actually chastised the government, I think, in his message. He said it's not in the spirit of the keeping, or it's not in keeping with the spirit of the letter of the Memorandum of Understanding. And in fact, the Ceann Comhairle, who is very much an independent authority, highlights this effectively is a political approach of the government to stimulate a bill it doesn't like, which is not a precedent that the Ceann Comhairle likes to see, and not a precedent I like to see. I think anyone in this House would like to see. I'm going to come back in again, but I would ask, just as I come back on this, could the committee be provided with the legal advice that was given initially that said to your predecessor that a money message was not necessary? And then could the committee be supplied with the legal advice that says now a money message is necessary? And in the spirit of the Ceann Comhairle's directive, could we get that in the next week, please?
You can be ruled maybe by the Comhairle. My understanding is that the ruling on the money message is by the Ceann Comhairle.
Well, no, Minister, you wrote to the Ceann Comhairle asking the Ceann Comhairle to make that ruling.
Yeah,
and I've read all the correspondence.
We can't, Deputy, just as we can't question there's a constitutional function there that the Ceann Comhairle has in relation to this, that we as a committee, it's not a matter for us to review it. That's what I was saying to Deputy Ryan there, and maybe he had other questions. He said he wasn't questioning the ruling of the Ceann Comhairle. He's gone now, but he'd want to write to the committee in relation to his questions and specifically what he's asking, because it's unclear. Sorry, I moved on to Deputy Ryan there. But just in relation to the Ceann Comhairle's decision, he has a constitutional right there, and it's not up to us to question his decision.
Well, perhaps just the Minister's decision. So I suppose what we're looking for here is to compare and contrast. A copy of the advice given to the previous Minister that said a money message wasn't required, and now the advice given to the current Minister that says a money message is required. And then we can have a look and tease it out maybe amongst ourselves as to what the difference is, apart from time and political climate.
And just maybe to clarify that, Deputy,
so I suppose
my officials telling me here that in my predecessor's time there was no advice got by us about a money message. It's a Ceann Comhairle.
Sorry, just let the Minister.
My understanding is that with the Ceann Comhairle they got that advice. So, and again, I stand corrected that I wasn't here, but what I would say is that's my understanding. And as I said earlier, if you want to bring in the legal people and have a discussion with them, that's up to the committee.
Yeah, okay.
The Bills office actually wrote to me and said this does not need a money message. That came from the Bills office, not from the Ceann Comhairle's office.
It's the Ceann Comhairle who sends this message, and any financial implications of any bill.
Sure, I think it's the Minister's decision we're most interested in. On the 26th of February 2018, there was a decision communicated from the Minister's office. So perhaps the rationale for the decision on 26th of February 2018. So perhaps we could have rationale from the Minister's office as to the grounds for that decision, that previous decision. That would be very helpful.
What date was that again?
26th of February 2018. There was a decision communicated from the Minister's office. Is my understanding, unless I'm open to correction, but my understanding is that there was.
I think that came from the Bills office. Deputy, I think you could be mixing that up with something else that particular date. We can come back and clarify.
So we can look into that. Perhaps the Minister
can we leave that?
But I just want to make it clear here that the Minister of the day does not make the decision. It is done by the Ceann Comhairle.
I don't accept the Minister. No disrespect.
Just to clarify.
Change of mind.
I have a letter here. Sorry, just to clarify, from the Bills office, dated the 26th of February 2018, to the then clerk of the committee, and that was that this bill does not require a money message, financial resolution, or ECB consultation. That's from the Bills office. Just that's the date I think you're referring to. Just I want to be very clear to make sure that we have the correct information. Okay, Deputy, do you have other questions for the Minister before I move on to Senator O'Reilly?
Briefly, Chair, I'm not happy with the answers to the last one. And I mean, the Ceann Comhairle's letter is quite clear. He points out he's re-examined the bill. The Ceann Comhairle has performed a second inspection of the bill and surrounding environment. He read all the second stage debates again. He read the committee stage debates again in light of the request that he re-evaluate. Just another question I'm going to put to you, and you may have to take this away. I appreciate you might, but perhaps again, in the spirit of Ceann Comhairle's directive, might come back to us as soon as possible, ideally in the next week. The Cairn Court has accepted the money message is required because of the direct financial implications being application fees for licences, maybe compensation to licence holders or prospective licence holders. The Department perhaps could clarify the number of licences or leases committed to, what types of licences, the commencement dates, their expiry dates, what legal agreements are out there, what kind of acreage we're talking about in these fields, and the fees associated with each. Basically, the details of all these prospective licences or existing licences that you'll have to compensate them for if this bill passes, because that would give us a greater understanding of the money message, and we could maybe assess the implications of it in light of that information.
That information will be made available. I think it could be on the website every 6 months it's published, but we'll make it available to you
in the next week.
Committee members, thank you very
That'd
much.
be great. Thank you, Minister.
I'm going to move on to Senator Joe O'Reilly, and then I have Deputy Stanley, and then Deputy Sherlock.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Chair, at the outset, I think it's a normal courtesy to welcome the Minister and his officials to the committee. I want to say at the outset that, and it's very important to say that at no point in Deputy Smith's submission did she suggest that there isn't goodwill right around this House, right around this committee in relation to the climate change issue, and I acknowledge that you never suggested that, Deputy Smith, because it is not the case. There is goodwill, and among other people, and I think Senator McDowell was anxious to preface his remarks similarly, and I think his bona fides has to be accepted there. I think I grew up on a farm in Cavan, and anyone who grew up on a farm with nature and that is more than acutely aware of all the issues here, and has a feel for it. And I just would say there's a few things. I mean, first of all, there's a report of the Joint Committee on Climate Change, all Joint Oireachtas Committee chaired by yourself, and that report, which is an all-party report, it makes a set of recommendations. The Citizens' Assembly has made a set of recommendations. So a consensus is emerging in the country that there is a climate change emergency, that we need to deal with the issue. That consensus is emerging, and that needed to emerge gradually through the Citizens' Assembly, through your committee, through public information, and indeed through the young people's actions in recent weeks. You needed that as a backdrop to any concerted actions, because you have to use that cliche term, you have to buy in, you have to have a sense of ownership of the project among the people. I think we're at that point now. I think the Minister is committed, and it's very clear from Minister Canny's remarks that the Minister is committed to publish a climate action plan within weeks. I'm also so aware from within my own political party at parliamentary party meetings, it is very imminent, the unveiling of a complete climate plan. I think, with great respects to Deputy Smith and others, and her bona fides are not at all, they're quite clearly very sound, but I think really, given that we've had the all-party committee, given that we'd had the Citizens' Assembly, given that we'd had the student issues, the student movement emerging around this, that I think it would be wise to wait on the climate plan. And I think it would be wise that we'd all buy into that plan, and that any proposals we'd make would be in the context of that plan. Now, I do think that personally, so I think we should go for the holistic approach, and then everything's a subset of that then. And it's open even to further amendment and discussion. I do think it's not fanciful to bring geopolitics into this. We don't know what the geopolitical situation will be and will emerge. And I do think we have to bear that in mind. I mean, some of I happen to have the privilege of being, and indeed the Minister is a former member, of being a member of the Council of Europe, and indeed leading the Irish delegation. But if you were there and listening to the people from Eastern Europe, some very arbitrary actions have been done by Russia, right from the Crimean into the Ukraine, right across, and there is a palpable fear there, and there's no reason to be smug or relaxed about that. There is a risk factor there that we can never fully forget about. And if it's the case, if that's a backdrop, but also if it's the case that we're going to need, and the science and the evidence from the Minister and his officials and from common sense would suggest that we are in transition and that for 20, 30 years we're going to need supplies of oil and gas. I mean, I personally don't see the logic in sourcing those outside the country. I sincerely don't, and I'm not being flippant or casual about it. I genuinely don't get that, why we wouldn't source them within and while working to eliminate them. Now, the fact that we get a tax return of 55%, I mean, cannot be ignored, because if we have very tight finances in the country because of a lot of infrastructural projects, because of a lot of other issues and our health, etc., that 55% tax surely can be used and ring-fenced and used within the whole climate change agenda, within developing green energy, retrofitting, etc., and I think it's better that we have that money and be using it rather than forego that money. Still need to go on with the green agenda and run it at dosh or cash in doing that. So I think that that has to be a consideration. I think that it strikes me, and please explain this to me, Minister. There are people wondering here about you seeking the Can Corliss opinion. I would have thought that that would be a perfectly normal exercise for a minister confronted with a legislative change, that they would check that it was not whether or not it was a money matter. I don't see that there's anything particularly untoward about that, and I would have thought that was the due process was involved there, and I would have thought then, as our chair pointed out earlier, that the legal position is that the Can Corliss position is not contraventable or cannot be contravened or argued with, and it is. I mean, even a level of applying a level of common sense, layman's approach to this, it's hardly conceivable that you could stop people with their licences, that you could do all that without costs. Apart from foregoing potential revenue, you have to be foregoing immediate. You have to be causing immediate costs and compensation. And while I take Senator McDowell's argument that you could argue in emergency situation, I think, to be truthful with you, that's a questionable enough proposition, and I presume the people who looked at this issue have thought that one through as well. I mean, while Senator McDowell is an acknowledged legal expert and one of the finest in the country, it's a questionable thesis that, given the nature of our constitution and the place of private property within it, that we can get away without some level of compensation therein. There is the point that we are going to need the electricity. We do need these batteries. A constant thing that's said to me in my own constituency or in my own home area, and right around when I meet people, is the absence of an infrastructure to back up the electric cars that we propose to put on the road. And that's one of the great arguments against them. And we're going to need that, and that has to be powered. So I think that's a question there. And I think therein you hold the whole question of security. And I'd be concerned on a number of levels not to have our domestic security. I think it's an interesting point that was made by the Minister, and it would make sense in the real world, that the tendency would be, as it happened in Norway and the UK, to sell the product into the indigenous domestic market, even from economies of scale, etc. Now, it's an interesting point the Minister raised earlier, and we can't avoid it either. And I'm a little bit, I'm privileged to have 3 sons, and each of them, they're into all the sciencey stuff that I don't understand, but they do talk to me about this. There is an amazing level of advances in technology at the moment, and it is a valid observation by the Minister that we may be fit in the future to decarbonise some of these products and to remove the carbon, and who knows what science will exist in 20 years, and obviously why not have our supply intact for then as we build up the green supplies as well, and that we keep the two parallel. And I think there's tremendous scientific advance. I also think there's advance in the green technology, And I think we have to keep abreast of science. And truthfully, and I would say this very, very with great respect, and I think we should all exercise just a level of constraint, a level of calm, while remaining determined. The one thing I sense, I've yet to meet in recent weeks, any member of this House, from any side, and from either houses of the Oireachtas, who's not committed to the project of dealing with climate change. I've not met them, and I think, I really believe that. And as a small island here with the nature of our economy, we don't have a particularly vested interest, nor should we, in doing anything else. So look, I would say we should wait on the actual climate action plan and all its constituent elements, work with that then. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I might bring in Deputy Stanley. Was there a question there? Sorry, as Minister.
Just about the financial implications and that, and neither the Minister nor the Department had any input into the original money message decision. And as you're aware, the Joint Oireachtas Library and Research Services reported to the Committee on the 31st of October 2018 its estimate that the direct exchequer cost estimate is between 8 and 50 million. And I wrote to the Committee on the 26th of November expressing similar concerns. So just to say that it isn't 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago that I brought this issue up first, or has been brought up first.
Okay. Deputy, sorry, Minister. Deputy Brian Stanley.
The representatives of the Department and Minister here. I think what's happened is very regrettable, and the fact that that it was the bill was so advanced that that this something was put into the spokes of the front wheel of this particular bicycle to grind it to a halt at this point in the form of a money message. And I listened carefully there to the last speaker where he talked about 20 years we might have technology to take the carbon out of fossil fuels and we could keep burning them. But in reality, that if we're serious about this, we actually don't have 20 years. We're already 20 years behind. We have 20 years catching up to do. And just, in the context as well, I think that it's Minister, it's very disheartening, that there was a lot of blarney about new politics and, the Oireachtas working together and the Oireachtas taking more of a role. And the amount of bills that have been ground to a halt in this way in the last couple of years is absolutely staggering. There's 8 Sinn Féin bills dealing with climate change matters since 2017. And if you take the waste reduction miscellaneous bill, comprehensive bill, the only comprehensive bill that's in front today, I know there is another bill, but the only bill that actually sets out in any comprehensive way how to reduce waste, that's stalled. Local Authority Climate Action Bill, that's been bounced around the various levels of bureaucracy. Microgeneration Support Scheme Bill, that's moving at snail's pace. There are 3 bills that I've brought forward. The Wind Turbine Regulation Bill, which seeks to put in place regulations which would allow us to harness wind in a sensible way, which we need to do. And the absence of it is having 2 effects. One is it's allowing multinational companies to come in a very heavy-handed way and to locate them where in totally inappropriate places and in an appropriate way, without any role for the local community or without any benefits to the local community. Whereas we should be doing in a more planned and in a more regulated way, locating wind turbines in a sensible way where the local community can have the benefit and where we could be reaping a much better reward in terms of renewable energy from it. And that's just 4 of it, that 8. And here we go again now with this bill from People Before Profit. And I've outlined from the beginning that there's issues, that we would change, parts of this bill that we would seek to amend. And that's fine. But the thrust of the bill, is going in the right direction, and we need to do it. And I just think that, that the way this has happened at such an advanced stage is very, very regrettable. And effectively, effectively what's happening, whether it's the dead hand of government stroke department, or whether it's whether there's influences being brought to bear in terms of, pardon the pun, a climate being created that that we have to stop all these measures and stop all such legislation, that we can't amend it and allow it to go through. I read the exchange of correspondence between yourself, the part of it's published anyway, between the department, yourself, Minister, and the Ceann and back. And by any read of it, it's it's clutching at straws in terms of hanging your hat on that to stop this bill from moving. And the questions I have is this: is that in 2018 and 2019, how many times was your department officials lobbied by oil companies, oil and gas companies, or their representatives? That's the first question I have. And the second question I have is that how many times have officials from your department met with oil and gas exploration companies in 2018 and in 2019? Because I do know that they were about the place here. They were certainly seeking to meet people, and they're fairly professional lobbyists. But perhaps you might answer that question for me. But I do, and I'll finish where I started. This isn't 20 years out. This isn't 30 years out. Yes, we recognise the reality that there's a transition to happen. But to stop this bill on that pretext, I think, is disingenuous, and it's very unfair to the 158 members of the Oireachtas and the 4.7 million people in this state, and humankind and the planet. The climate change is happening at an accelerated rate. We're realists about it in Sinn Féin, but we do want to get the solutions right. We know that you can't turn off one switch and switch on another one tomorrow morning. We understand that, but to say that we can't progress legislation to try and deal with these matters, I think that it's very unfair and it's very unrealistic. And I think that I heard about waiting for the government climate action plan. We've been told that on everything, but that doesn't stop any of these things, any of these bills from moving forward. And I've been told, if you just taken the wind turbine regulation bill, right, that's absolutely mind-numbing. The amount of times that myself and others have raised these issues in the chamber. My predecessor, Michael Kilreevy, who was a spokesperson for Sinn Féin on the environment in the last Dáil, he raised it on numerous occasions. And the fact that the government have failed to just put that simple measure in place, shows the dead hand that's on top of matters. And we did hope, and I certainly hoped, when the new Dáil, 32nd Dáil, came into being, that there was great talk about new politics and new beginning and everything else. And it's very disheartening to see that progressive legislation being felled in this way.
Have you other questions, Deputy?
No, that's my questions.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I suppose when you talk about private members' bills, I just want to remind you of two bills that were passed by the Dáil, and one of them was the fracking bill by Tony McLaughlin, private members' bill, and the other one was the Fossil Fuel Investment Act, introduced by Deputy Tomás Pringle. Both of them have been passed. You asked the question in relation to how many times were the officials lobbied and how many times did they meet with oil companies or representatives. And I suppose, just to say, in general terms, the officials within the department would meet in their course of their duties, would interact and meet on a regular basis with companies holding licences. They would be talking to them and querying their work programmes. They're checking their financials for works programmes and also seeking reports and data arising from these work programmes. So there has to be interaction. You know, there has to
Money
be...
Climate Minister.
Now, if I could tell you now, if you want us to go back and find that out, I don't know if we can find it out.
I would like to answer to that.
The other question is, you asked how many
Sure, there's
times...
a record of it.
Just let the Minister finish.
and the other question was, how many times were they lobbied? So I don't know if they have been lobbied, but if there's any information like that that is available, I'll make it.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Sean Sherlock.
Thank you, Chair. And, though I'm not a member of the committee, I appreciate you giving me some time today, and I too appreciate the fact that the Minister is before us. I just want to start with the Minister's last comment to the effect of saying that the government of the day accepted the anti-fracking legislation, and that was with the goodwill of all of the members of the House. It passed, as I understand it, unanimously. There were no dissenting voices on that. If one takes the view that fracking is, by its very nature, subject to licences and subject to exploration, though I use that term loosely, surely, be to goodness, the same could be applied, the same concept and understanding could be applied in respect of exploration offshore. Is that not the case? That's my first question.
The question, just to get it clear, is that
if you've applied the same principles to the issue of fracking, and you've supported, as you've stated yourself, the anti-fracking legislation for reasons, relation to climate action, for reasons in relation to it being injurious to the environment, in relation to the disturbance that it would bring to communities. In at least two of those three principles that I've outlined, you can apply the same principle to this legislation.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I would say to you is that in the area of fracking, one of the big concerns has always been that with fracking you would interrupt or interfere with water supply and the quality of water supply. That's a big thing. And the other thing is that with traffic as well. Now, when a licence is being granted through the process we're doing here, there are so many consents that have to be achieved before you get a licence to do exploration or to do the different stages along the way. So what you're saying to me is that do we compare fracking and the potential damage that can do to the environment to the way we're licensing,
What I'm saying, Minister, is that, and I do take the point you're making, but if you're talking about the issuance of licences, and if the revenue foregone from those licences is the reason why there is a justification, as I understand it, for a money message,
right,
so as not to allow the bill to proceed to the next stage, why is it then that you didn't apply the same principle to the fracking legislation in respect of revenues foregone on that legislation to the legislation that's before us now?
I don't believe that we had any applications for fracking licences.
There were.
We did.
Yes. There were licences.
Yeah.
Why is it then that you did not apply the same principles? Why is it that you're not applying the same principles to this legislation as you are to that, if the government of the day had in fact issued the licences in the first instance?
Because if you take it, the licences we have issued at the moment, or whatever stages they're at, we can only prevent them licences or stop them licences from proceeding to the next stage if the company do not meet the standards and fulfil all the obligations in terms of environmental assessment and all of that. And also, the other thing is that if you take it that the fracking would give you limited potential, whereas what's happening at the moment in terms of licences that have been issued, there's more chances of getting off the licences yielding something that would be of benefit to the stage in an environmentally friendly way.
Thank you, Minister. My second question, I'm not sure I accept the answer, but I think it warrants further exploration. I realise we don't have a whole pile of time here now. My second question relates to the actual process now of examining what defines a money message for the purposes of allowing this bill to proceed to next stage or not proceeding, as the case may be. I don't intend to get into the interpretations of the Ceann Comhairle's decision or ruling on that, except to say that there is a memorandum of understanding as between all of the members of this House and the government of today in respect of private members' bills, and it is arguable that the government has absolutely contravened the spirit of that memorandum of understanding and has been, it is arguable, been disrespectful to the individual members of this House who've brought forward legislation. But I just want to know what the process is in the most simplest of terms, because I don't understand now what it is that you need to do in order to define, for the purposes of justifying the government's argument in respect of what needs to be done to deliver on or not, as the case may be, in respect of the money message. What is it that you need to do now to justify your position in respect of the requirement for a money message?
Well, what do I have to do to justify my position? That's the question you're asking.
To be clear, the Ceann Comhairle has determined that a money message is required.
Yes.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
So in order for a money message to be delivered upon,
Yeah.
it is not the Ceann Comhairle that will go away and do that business. It is the government of the day.
Yeah.
What now needs to be done to deliver the money message? Or not deliver the money message, depending on justification. And I suspect that the government of today will decide, has already made its decision and is seeking now at this stage to quash this legislation.
The government have to make a decision on whether or not they will provide the money message. That's it.
And no, but what does that mean, you see?
It means that the government have to make a decision on it.
No, I appreciate that, Minister, but Chair, the question is, how do you make that determination? What are the criteria that you use in determining that decision? Do you look at the opportunity cost foregone in respect of licences? What is the process? Because if I bring forward a piece of legislation in respect of health or education, and if I'm told it requires a money message because there is a charge on the Exchequer, either a first order charge or an incidental charge, if I am the proposer of the legislation, surely be to goodness I'm entitled to know exactly what it is that the government intends to do with the piece of legislation that I've drafted, as per Deputy Smith's contention, and how it is that the government of today intends to deliver its money message. What is the process and the mechanism that you must now do in respect of deciding upon a money message? And if that question can't be answered, then I would contend, Minister, through the Chair, that this has been a subversion of the democratic process here.
Sorry, there's to be absolutely no applauding, no talking. I'm sorry, I'm telling you now, there's to be absolutely no applauding, no talking. Well, please stop talking. I'm now telling you, please, in the public gallery, that is completely out of order, and I will adjourn the meeting if that continues.
Just to simply answer the question for you, and you want it as simply as possible, the government will now decide whether or not the money message will be given, based on the financial implications to the state.
Okay. Well, could I ask then, Chair, that there would be a further articulation of that given to this committee at some stage in respect of what exactly that means? Because I think it would be useful for me as one member of this House to actually understand that process, and I don't understand that process.
My understanding of the process is that it is up to government to give a reasoned opinion in relation to they either grant or do not grant a money message. That is what I have received here, and they give a reasoned opinion in relation to that.
Fair enough.
And I suppose it may be the timing of that, Deputy. I don't know. That could be asked
Chair,
here. But that's what I have here in relation to the procedure, that a reasoned opinion would be given,
I
whether
understand
it's granted or not.
Thank you, Chair. I understand that a reasoned opinion will be given and a justification. What I'm seeking to understand is how, within your individual line department, what is the criteria when the Secretary-General sits down with you, or the Assistant Secretary-Generals and the Principal Officers sit down to go through this process, and we must now report to the Dáil, on our decision in relation to the deliverance of a money message? What are the criteria that we're setting out internally for the justification of our position, regardless of what that is? Now, I don't expect the Minister to answer that now. If he can answer
Minister,
that now,
do you
that
want
would
to
be
come in
useful.
on this now? I might give him an opportunity if he doesn't want to come in.
You might be... I cannot direct you or the committee on what they do, right?
That's not what I'm saying, Minister.
And what I'm saying is that what we were going to... what will happen here is the government will decide whether to support this and they'll set out the reasons why or not.
Okay.
I think that
That's
it
normal.
clarifies that is the normal procedure, and that is procedure how I understand it and how I have received here in writing in relation to a money message being granted or not. If it's not, there will be a reasoned opinion given. If it is, it's granted, and it's the government, and it is the government who will be issuing
Deputy
that.
Sherlock's question. The criteria for the money message, as I understand it, has already been set out by the Ceann Comhairle in his very considered letter. And on 4 points, he is allowing a money message, but not on one very serious point, which is the research from the library services, which would be predictive of what we might have gained in the future. He's allowing it on 4 points, and those 4 points, as far as I remember, are on the question of having to return the fees for leases and licences, and on certain legal costs that accrue to the state. And only on those, and if the money message comes on anything else, then that is not what the Ceann Comhairle ruled.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, these are again our procedures. This is not again for our consideration in relation to the Ceann Comhairle's decision, and it is up to government now to come back to the committee to give a money message or not. Okay, that is the procedure. So let's be very clear in relation to that. Have you another question, Deputy Sherlock?
So just my final intervention. Yeah. And thank you, Chair, for that, and thank you, Deputy Smith. Yeah. But I think it is worthwhile, because we have a Minister in front of us here, to question the Minister in respect of the internal dynamics of the process of examining the money message procedure from the Minister's departmental point of view. And that's merely what I'm trying to do. Whatever about the Ceann Comhairle has written on this. The department must now, respond.
The government, yeah.
Well, the department.
If I just
Minister,
clarify, the letter that I wrote to the Ceann Comhairle set out the grounds on which I thought and the department understood there would be a money message required. The Ceann Comhairle has made a deliberation on that, and he's made a decision. That decision now goes to government. Government will make a decision on whether a money message will be given or not, based on the 4 points you're talking about.
Okay. I think that clears up that procedure.
That's my understanding.
That clears up the procedure, and that's as far as we can go in relation to this issue at the moment.
Final intervention. That was just
final intervention before I bring in Deputy Smith. And then.
And thank you. So, the point was made earlier that this is not, that this shouldn't be caught up as a geopolitical issue. I would contend that it is a geopolitical issue. I would contend that when you have organisations like Trócaire advocating on behalf of this legislation, which is an organisation that is funded from the public purse, which seeks to bridge the divide between the global north and the global south, and which seeks to advocate on issues such as the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and in respect of how the global north does its business and how that has a massive impact on the most poorest people living on the planet, well then I would suggest to you that this legislation is very germane to that very issue, and that's just a point I want to address in relation to the Senator's, Senator O'Reilly's earlier point. I think it is very germane to a geopolitical
I'm going to
context.
bring in the Minister briefly, and then to Deputy Smith, who has a small question, I understand.
And just to state on that, before the Deputy goes, that neither the Citizens' Assembly or made a recommendation in favour of this climate emergency bill, and neither did the Oireachtas committee.
Okay.
So just to say that,
Deputies.
it's just that people might think that that the Citizens' Assembly did not say that this bill would be the way to go.
Okay, Deputy Smith.
There was a complicated voting record with the Oireachtas committee, but.
No, the climate change.
Oh, sorry.
Deputy Smith.
Okay, I feel I have to respond to this accusation that I ignore the question of the future and the reliance that the state will have after 2030 on some level of usage of gas. And I'm going to use your argument back to you. You say that by 2030 we'll be 70% our energy will come 70% from renewables. Where does the other 30% come from? Well, at the moment, we import 50% of our gas needs. So if by 2030 we only have to import 30%, isn't that an improvement? And here comes the geopolitical argument, because I've heard what Senator McDowell said, what Senator O'Reilly said, what you intimated, and what's been said many times in these discussions about Putin and Russia and insecurity and all the rest of it. Most of our imports come from North Sea at the moment. That could continue, should continue, if we have to rely on imports for a short period of time. But your logic is that at the moment, no, that's going to be very insecure for us, and they're not reliable sources at all. We'd be far better off relying on a combination of ExxonMobil and the Chinese National Oil Corporation, who have been given the licence that was referred to earlier by Deputy Ryan. Now, we've just celebrated, or just marked, the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and it was dominated by tyranny, abuse, human rights abuses, suppression of people, murder of people, jailing of people by the Chinese state. So what makes them nicer guys than Putin? And what makes Putin such a nice guy that one of the companies that are continually lobbying this House, Petrol Resources, do deals with Gazprom in the Crimea? I find the whole thing so contradictory in terms of energy security. The fundamental point, however, is there will be no security in a planet that will overheat by more than 2 degrees, and that is not disputable. That is the science, and if you accept the science of climate catastrophe and emergency, then that is indisputable. So the question of security is being used on a spurious way in the geopolitical argument. I do not accept whatsoever, no matter how many times you try to frame it this way or that. And the other very obvious argument is that there is no legal obligation on any company who have received an exploration licence or a drilling licence from your department to sell whatever they get back to the Irish state. No legal obligation on them whatsoever. So our natural resources are not our natural resources. Long ago, during the whole campaign around Shell to Sea and all the rest of it, our natural resources were sold out, and that continues to be the case. But I would like to see our natural resources remain in the ground, because somebody said earlier on that if we get 55% tax back on these, wouldn't that be great to help towards climate change initiatives? But that's contradictory. Taking it out of the ground and burning more carbon, and then using the tax that you get on it to, I don't know, build an extra bicycle lane or put another electric bus on the streets of Galway. That is just crazy. That just isn't doing your politics in a correct way. And finally, Minister, I would like to say this to you. We're going to continue fighting this, and we have currently seeking legal advice on what has happened with this money message, and we're going to continue fighting it. People are going to be outside the door now in half an hour, and they're going to be calling on you to keep it in the ground and not to kill this bill. And the movement is big. It involves tens of thousands of school children, as well as tens of thousands of citizens, not just here but across the globe. And there isn't a tricolour flying out of the carbon that gets emitted from whatever fuel is going to be extracted off the Kerry coast or the Donegal coast. It doesn't recognise the boundaries. This is an atmosphere that we share globally as a human race, and we need to take responsibility to do something about it. You could be famous. You could be a leader. One of 5 countries to have acknowledged that we need to ban the exploration of fossil fuels. It could be the makings of your political endeavour to do something decent for this globe.
Thank you, Deputy.
And I think we're going to just keep fighting you legally and outside with the movement and every which way. And I want to thank all the deputies who are on side with us for that.
Minister, before I go to Deputy Ryan finally.
Well, maybe if Deputy Ryan...
Deputy Ryan, do you have a question before I... Yeah.
Just to explain again why I think and why I'm seeking the legal advice from the Oireachtas Legal Services, separate to whatever Deputy Smith will have in terms of legal advice. It was unprecedented in this. Now in this stall, there's been a lot of our own waste reduction bill has been delayed for 2 years by the department using a money order, but it was always clear from the start that that was the mechanism that the government was going to use. But this bill, clearly through a year and a half of our work, there was the clear understanding in our debates, in every discussion, that and money order would not apply in this bill. There were other mechanisms used, particularly the split vote in the Joint Oireachtas Committee, which looked at it. That, when we finally overcame it, and when it was only came to the last minute that we were actually about to go into committee stage, and I believe in committee stage one of the outcome would be there would be amendments to the bill to make it clear that it wouldn't put a financial burden on the state, because it would clearly only apply to new, that there are different views on that, but that's my expectation of where it would have gone. But it was the use then at the last minute of the money order to stop a debate which was due to take place, that other mechanisms had tried to, that's what I believe is where the executive is exceeding its powers. It's taking that constitutional provision that you can't have the opposition writing the budget, which is fair, obviously we have to respect that. But what's happened in this instance wasn't that. It was tactical use of it. It seems to me, from the timelines and the process that's been involved, which is why it makes it a particularly egregious example of executive showing disrespect to the Oireachtas and to the people who represented us. And that's why I think the core of the problem, as well as the actual underlying issue about government support for this bill. But it's the process we've been through is, I believe, disrespectful of the Oireachtas in a way that exceeds the executive's powers.
Finally.
I would just say, again, I repeat that I first brought this to the attention of the committee back last November, that there was issues with the finances of it. So it's not something that has come in the last couple of weeks. I don't do anything underhand. I stated it then, I stated it again, I think in the Dáil, could be on the record, that I had concerns about the finances of it. But definitely what I would say to you is that from listening to everybody talking today about this, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about the bill. And as I said at the outset, this bill is well intentioned. I just think that this bill is coming on its own without the full plan on how we're going to do things. We have to accept that we have a long-term challenge we need to meet in terms of achieving a net carbon neutral economy, and we should consider the future for energy supply and our energy consumption, including Ireland's own exploration and production, in a holistic, strategic manner. We have to do that. And what I would say is that, and I would say this not just respectfully, I think that this bill is not the right way to go about it. It's a standalone measure which does not consider the wider implications. And the other thing it does not do is make us any more carbon efficient in this country. This bill will not do that. Therefore, our efforts should focus on the plan to reduce Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions that the government will shortly announce. We should. There are difficult decisions that everybody will have to make, and there are challenges to be rolled out to reduce these emissions. And I look forward to this committee's support in that regard. And I thank you for your contributions today.
Thank you, Minister. And the Joint Committee now stands adjourned until 5 p.m. on the 12th of June. Thank you.